Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back. Today we're looking at a real wartime decision, how one aircraft was deliberately built around a different set of assumptions, and how that choice reshaped the air war in the Pacific. This isn't a story about a miracle machine or a single ace. It's about a design philosophy, the numbers it produced, and the moment one side realized the rules had changed. On September 1, 1943, at Rabaul Airfield on New Britain, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai held a new intelligence summary in his left hand and let it hover for a second over the map table. The canvas walls of the operations tent trapped heat like a kiln. Fuel fumes hung in the air, and sweat darkened the collars of the officers leaning in to listen. Sakai's one good eye moved line by line across the translated specifications, and then he laughed. Not because he was careless, but because the data looked absurd. The Americans, the report claimed, had introduced a carrier fighter so heavy it bordered on a small bomber. Loaded weight, more than 12,000 pounds. In Sakai's world, a fighter that heavy was already defeated before the engine even started. To understand why he laughed, you have to understand what the Japanese Navy believed they had proven since December 7, 1941. Their early war results did not feel like luck. They looked like a stable equation. At Pearl Harbor, the strike force returned having lost 29 aircraft while inflicting catastrophic losses. In the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies, Japanese naval aviation carved through Allied air forces with ratios that seemed to hold regardless of opponent. The zero appeared to be the constant that made the equation work: range, climb, turn, and the ability to decide when to fight and when to disengage. The Zero was not a traditional fighter improved by small refinements. It was a deliberate bet placed by engineers and admirals on one concept: that air combat would be decided by turning performance and pilot skill, and that anything that reduced those traits was a mistake. The designers stripped weight wherever they could. Armor plate was omitted. Self-sealing fuel tanks were not installed. Even radios were often unreliable or removed to save weight and simplify maintenance. The structure was light, the wing loading low, the controls responsive at speeds where heavier fighters became unstable. In 1941 and 1942, those choices produced a tactical reality. Most Allied fighters could not survive a sustained turning fight. By 1943, that reality had hardened into doctrine and confidence. When Japanese intelligence officers reviewed the Hellcat's specifications, their conclusions followed the logic they already trusted. A heavy airframe suggested sluggish response. Armor suggested compromised agility. The American approach, as they interpreted it, was to compensate for inferior pilots with machinery. Captain Minoru Genda, who had planned Pearl Harbor and understood carrier aviation as well as any man in the Navy, summarized the dismissal in the cold language of staff work. The Americans, he argued, were continuing a flawed philosophy, adding weight instead of refining skill. In the Japanese frame, the Hellcat was not a threat. It was evidence the enemy still did not understand the game. On paper, the comparison looked decisive. Wing loading was one of the simplest predictors of turning performance. The Zero sat around 22 pounds per square foot. The Hellcat, according to reports, exceeded 36. Japanese tactics were built around forcing the enemy into a turning fight, where the Zero could reverse direction faster, maintain control at lower speeds, and steadily tighten the circle until the opponent presented a clean shot. If those numbers were true, then the Hellcat could be made helpless the way other American fighters had been. The intelligence summary looked like confirmation that the old methods would continue to work. What these calculations failed to measure was intent. The Hellcat was not designed to win a turning contest with the Zero. It was designed to make that contest irrelevant. That design intent was visible even in the features Japanese analysts mocked. The Hellcat carried armor to protect the pilot and vital systems, because surviving the first burst mattered more than shaving a few pounds. It carried self-sealing tanks, because endurance and repeat sorties mattered more than the clean elegance of a light airframe. It carried radios that worked reliably, because coordination and formation discipline mattered more than the myth of the lone duelist. And it carried a powerful engine, an American industrial product built for consistency and high output, because the aircraft was meant to fight in the vertical plane, where horsepower and energy conversion decided the engagement. The first operational Hellcat units arrived in the Pacific in the summer of 1943, and by September they were already shaping how American carriers protected themselves. Hellcats flew combat air patrols high above task forces, operating with guidance from radar pickets and fighter direction officers. From a Japanese cockpit, those early sightings could look unimpressive. Distant, dark blue aircraft, high altitude, sometimes breaking off early rather than pressing into close combat. That behavior was interpreted as caution, even fear. It fit the Japanese expectation that Americans still lacked the will or skill for the kind of turning fight Japanese pilots had mastered. For the men at Rabaul, Truk, Wake, and the scattered island fields that formed Japan's defensive perimeter, that interpretation was comforting. Many were veterans who had flown since China, who had survived Guadalcanal and the grinding attrition of 1942. They trusted the Zero because it had kept them alive. They trusted the old methods because those methods had produced victories that seemed consistent and repeatable. Their confidence did not come from emotion. It came from numbers they had watched accumulate across 2 years of war. But in September 1943, the Americans were no longer trying to beat Japan at Japan's chosen contest. The Hellcat was entering combat as part of an integrated system: radar detection, radio coordination, standardized training that emphasized energy tactics, and a production pipeline capable of replacing aircraft and crews at a scale Japan could not match. The Zero had been a masterpiece of individual performance. The Hellcat was built to function inside a machine, one that could find you first, place itself above you, and refuse every fight you wanted. In the humid tent at Rabaul, none of that was visible yet. The Hellcat still looked wrong to the Japanese eye: too thick, too heavy, too industrial. It seemed to violate principles that had delivered domination in 1941 and 1942. Sakai's laugh, in that moment, was the sound of a doctrine that still believed it was describing the future. Within 30 days, the first encounters would begin producing a new set of ratios, and once those ratios appeared, they would not stop. Write in the comments what city you're from and subscribe to the channel. That's the best support. And now we move on. The first confirmed encounter between Japanese naval fighters and the F-6F Hellcat occurred on September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island, and it immediately challenged assumptions that had guided Japanese air tactics for more than 2 years. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance aircraft on what was expected to be a routine mission at the edge of Japanese defensive airspace. Visibility was good, the weather stable, and the threat environment familiar. When Fukui spotted 6 dark blue aircraft climbing toward him from the southeast, his initial assessment was almost automatic. Their bulk suggested medium bombers, perhaps B-25s approaching on an unusual heading. Only when the aircraft turned into the sun did the illusion break. The shapes were wrong for bombers: single engines, no twin tails, but with fuselages far larger than any American fighter Fukui had previously encountered. In his after-action report, he would later note the moment of hesitation, the brief recalculation as training and instinct collided. These were fighters, but fighters that appeared to violate everything he understood about that category. Their wings seemed too short for their weight, their noses too large, their climb steady rather than sharp. They looked inefficient, almost clumsy, and that perception shaped his next decision. Fukui responded exactly as doctrine prescribed. He rolled his Zero into a diving turn, aiming to reduce speed separation and force the enemy into a horizontal maneuvering fight. This was not improvisation. It was a maneuver drilled repeatedly in training, refined through combat since China, and validated against every Allied fighter encountered so far. The Zero's low wing loading allowed it to tighten the turn progressively, curving inward toward the enemy's tail while maintaining control at falling airspeeds. In previous encounters, American pilots either attempted to turn and lost or dove away to escape. The Hellcat did neither. Instead of continuing forward or flattening into a turn, the American fighter pulled sharply upward, converting forward speed into altitude with a confidence that immediately surprised Fukui. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, delivering close to 2,000 horsepower, drove the aircraft into a steep climb that the Zero could not match without sacrificing energy. Fukui followed out of habit, not yet understanding that the engagement geometry had shifted. As the climb steepened, his airspeed decayed rapidly, and the Zero's light structure, so effective in level turns, became a disadvantage against gravity. At approximately 15,000 feet, the Hellcat executed a hammerhead turn, pivoting on its propeller torque and dropping nose down directly behind Fukui. The maneuver was unexpected, not because it was unknown, but because it seemed incompatible with the aircraft's apparent weight. 6.50 caliber machine guns opened fire from long range. Fukui reported 17 impacts in roughly 3 seconds. The volume and density of fire were unlike anything he had experienced. Only by deliberately entering a spin and sacrificing altitude did he escape destruction. He landed back at Marcus Island with his Zero riddled with holes. His wingman and the reconnaissance aircraft never returned. 5 days later, on October 5, 1943, the same pattern appeared during an American carrier strike against Wake Island. 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group were scrambled to intercept what initially looked like another limited raid. Japanese pilots approached the engagement with confidence. They held altitude, numerical parity, and favorable positioning. According to established doctrine, these factors should have guaranteed at least tactical success, if not outright victory. The Hellcats they encountered behaved nothing like the American fighters they had previously defeated. Instead of scattering under attack, the Hellcats maintained formation. They did not attempt to evade through tight turns or sudden dives. Early Japanese fire achieved visible hits, but the American aircraft continued to fly, their armor and self-sealing fuel tanks preventing immediate losses. When the Zeros completed their diving passes and attempted to climb back to altitude, the Hellcats counterattacked. Using their superior power, they regained height quickly, then rolled into steep dives from above, firing briefly before climbing again. Japanese pilots found themselves perpetually reacting, never able to force the Americans into a sustained engagement on favorable terms. The engagement ended decisively. 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcats were lost. For the Japanese pilots involved, the result was not immediately interpreted as a disaster, but it was deeply unsettling. After-action reports from October 1943 do not describe panic or collapse. Instead, they reveal confusion. Pilots consistently remarked on the Hellcat's resilience, its refusal to disengage in familiar ways, and its ability to absorb punishment without losing effectiveness. The aircraft did not flee, as earlier American fighters often had, nor did it attempt to outturn the Zero. It seemed to operate according to a different set of priorities. This difference was not merely technical, but geometric. Japanese pilots began to note that Hellcats controlled vertical space in ways the Zero could not contest for long. The American fighters entered engagements with excess energy, converted it into attack positions, and exited before the Zero could respond. The Zero's superiority in sustained turning flight remained real, but it was increasingly irrelevant. The Hellcat simply refused to enter that environment. Instead, it imposed its own geometry on the battle, one defined by altitude, speed, and timing rather than radius and angle. By November 1943, experienced pilots such as Lieutenant Commander Tadao Tanamizu began briefing younger aviators with unusually direct warnings. In surviving accounts, Tanamizu emphasized that the Americans no longer fought as individuals. They fought as coordinated units, guided by radio communication and operating with mutual support. While a Japanese pilot focused on one opponent, another Hellcat was already diving from above. Engagements were no longer isolated duels, but overlapping attacks managed across the entire airspace. Japanese pilots, trained to seek decisive individual combat, were entering battles already lost at the conceptual level. The Zero's strengths had not disappeared. In a pure turning fight at low altitude, it remained unmatched. But those conditions were now increasingly rare, created only when American pilots made mistakes. The Hellcat's design accepted higher wing loading in exchange for survivability, power, and speed. Its doctrine emphasized retaining energy and choosing when to engage, rather than committing to prolonged maneuvering. This approach reduced risk and maximized pilot survival. It was not elegant, but it was effective, and it aligned perfectly with American training and production capacity. What began as isolated encounters in late September became a consistent operational pattern by the end of October 1943. Engagement after engagement followed the same sequence: initial Japanese confidence, brief contact, rapid escalation driven by American control of altitude, and disengagement under fire. Losses accumulated disproportionately on the Japanese side. No single battle announced a turning point. Instead, the shift revealed itself through repetition. The numbers began to change quietly, without drama or declaration. And once they did, they continued in the same direction, steadily and without reversal. By December 1943, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a conclusion that had become impossible to ignore. The F-6F Hellcat was not simply a heavier American fighter that happened to perform well in certain conditions. It was the outward expression of a much larger system, one that extended far beyond the aircraft itself. This realization did not arrive suddenly, but through accumulation, through damaged machines, missing pilots, and reports that described the same pattern repeated across different fronts. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the former leader of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, now served in an operational planning and analysis role. His responsibilities included reviewing combat reports and inspecting aircraft returning from engagements with American carrier forces. What he observed was unsettling in its consistency. Zeros that returned from encounters with Hellcats often bore clusters of small-caliber hits around the cockpit, fuel lines, and engine cowling. Even when pilots survived, the damage was frequently fatal to the aircraft. Hellcats, by contrast, returned with superficial penetration, torn skin panels, and shattered canopies, yet with pilots alive and engines still functioning. The explanation was not found in pilot behavior or morale. It was found in construction. The Hellcat carried more than 200 pounds of armor plate protecting the pilot, oil system, and control linkages. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, capable of absorbing repeated hits without igniting. In contrast, the Zero's light structure and unprotected tanks meant that even a small number of impacts could cause catastrophic fire or structural failure. The Japanese aircraft had been optimized to avoid being hit. The American aircraft assumed it would be hit and was built accordingly. Firepower widened the gap further. The Hellcat's 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns delivered nearly 5,000 rounds per minute in a concentrated forward arc. Each projectile carried several times the kinetic energy of the Japanese rifle-caliber rounds still standard on most Zeros. Japanese pilots reported that brief bursts from Hellcats produced immediate structural damage, severed control cables, and incapacitated pilots even without direct cockpit penetration. American gunnery emphasized short, accurate firing windows rather than prolonged chases, maximizing lethality while minimizing exposure. More disturbing than armor or guns were reports of American interception methods. By late 1943, Japanese pilots increasingly described being attacked without warning, often from above or out of cloud. Shipborne radar detected incoming formations at distances exceeding 100 miles, long before Japanese pilots could visually identify enemy aircraft. Fighter direction officers aboard American carriers and picket ships tracked these contacts continuously, guiding Hellcat patrols into ideal interception positions. By the time Japanese pilots realized they were under attack, the geometry of the engagement had already been decided. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described his first radar-directed interception in a report dated December 1943. His formation was climbing through layered cloud when Hellcats appeared above them, perfectly aligned with their course. There had been no sighting, no gradual build-up to contact. The Americans arrived already positioned for attack, diving with speed and accuracy. Komachi concluded that the enemy appeared to know their altitude, heading, and speed before the first shot was fired. Japanese pilots, reliant on eyesight and visual lookout, were effectively blind in comparison. This environment exposed weaknesses in Japanese training doctrine that had previously been masked by the Zero's performance. Pre-war naval aviators underwent years of training, accumulating hundreds of flight hours and mastering aerobatics, gunnery, and formation tactics. By late 1943, fuel shortages and attrition forced drastic reductions. New pilots arrived at the front with fewer than 300 hours of flight time, sometimes far less. Gunnery practice was restricted to minimal ammunition allotments. Radio procedures were taught theoretically, without sufficient flight hours to make them instinctive. American pilots entered combat under very different conditions. Their training was standardized, repetitive, and heavily focused on formation discipline and gunnery accuracy. They practiced energy-based tactics extensively, learning when to attack and, more importantly, when to disengage. American doctrine emphasized survival and repeatability. Pilots were not trained to seek decisive individual victories, but to remain alive, maintain formation integrity, and return for the next sortie. Experience was treated as a resource to be preserved, not expended. This divergence produced outcomes that appeared increasingly predetermined. Veteran Japanese aces could sometimes survive encounters with Hellcats through skill, caution, or luck. Newly arrived pilots rarely did. The Hellcats' forgiving flight characteristics, heavy protection, and concentrated firepower allowed average American pilots to defeat less experienced opponents reliably. Individual brilliance mattered less than the system in which the pilot operated. Skill could no longer compensate for structural disadvantage. By the end of 1943, Japanese intelligence summaries began to acknowledge the shift explicitly. The Zero was no longer dominant. Air combat was no longer decided by turning performance alone. Speed, altitude control, coordination, and endurance had become the determining factors. The Americans had changed the conditions under which air combat took place, and Japan lacked the means to respond symmetrically. The Imperial Japanese Navy faced a strategic dilemma with no practical solution. It did not possess the industrial capacity to redesign and mass-produce a fundamentally new fighter in time. It lacked sufficient fuel to restore pilot training to pre-war standards, and it lacked the operational breathing room to experiment with new doctrine under combat conditions. Every engagement accelerated pilot losses and reduced the pool of experience needed for adaptation. The Hellcat had not defeated Japanese aviation through a single decisive battle or technological surprise. It had done so by altering the mathematics of survival. Each engagement slightly favored the American pilot. Over time, those margins compounded. Attrition became inevitable, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the system they faced was designed to win repeatedly, while their own was not. What lay ahead was no longer a contest between individual aircraft or even between fighter designs. It was a process of sustained attrition driven by detection, coordination, and replacement. Japanese naval aviation, once the most experienced in the world, had entered a struggle it could not endure for long. By early 1944, air combat in the Pacific had crossed a threshold beyond which individual skill no longer determined outcomes. Engagements were no longer decided in the cockpit or even at the moment of contact. They were being decided statistically, hours before aircraft ever met, by detection ranges, climb rates, fuel states, and the number of fighters that could be placed at a specific altitude at a specific time. Japanese pilots increasingly understood that survival against Hellcats depended less on flying ability than on probability. Each sortie now carried a calculable risk of not returning, independent of experience. This reality became undeniable on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining carrier air strength to Operation A-Go, a decisive engagement intended to cripple American carrier forces and restore strategic balance. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched 4 strike waves totaling 373 aircraft from 9 carriers, many flown by the last experienced pilots available. Against them stood Task Force 58, whose radar coverage and fighter strength had reached a level of integration Japan could no longer counter. American radar detected the first Japanese wave at a distance exceeding 150 miles. This early warning did more than provide time to react. It allowed the battle to be shaped before contact. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcat squadrons into precise interception positions, adjusting altitude, heading, and spacing in real time. By the time Japanese pilots sighted the enemy, the engagement geometry had already been fixed. Hellcats were stacked in altitude bands between 20 and 30,000 feet, occupying the vertical space the Japanese would need to survive. Japanese strike formations entered a 3-dimensional trap. Their escorts found themselves below American fighters, deprived of altitude advantage and unable to accelerate without sacrificing cohesion. Attempts to climb were met by diving attacks. Attempts to dive exposed them to additional interceptors waiting below. The Zero's strengths, tight turning and low-speed control, could not be brought to bear when speed and altitude were controlled by the opponent. The battle unfolded not as a dogfight, but as a sequence of interceptions. The results were catastrophic. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched that day, 243 were destroyed. The majority fell to Hellcats. American losses amounted to fewer than 30 aircraft from all causes. The disparity was so extreme that it entered history under a name that reflected not bravado, but shock: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The ratio was no longer merely unfavorable, it was annihilative, and it exposed the full consequences of the systemic imbalance that had been building since late 1943. Japanese after-action reports reveal the psychological effect of this shift. Pilots described Hellcats appearing simultaneously from multiple directions, diving with overwhelming speed, firing brief, precise bursts, then climbing beyond reach. Attempts to pursue ended in stalls and immediate destruction. Engagements lasted seconds, not minutes. The Zero's maneuverability, once the foundation of Japanese tactics, was irrelevant without the energy to use it. Pilots were no longer fighting other pilots. They were colliding with a managed airspace. The loss of experienced aircrew was irreparable. Japan's pre-war naval aviation cadre, the product of years of selective training and combat refinement, was nearly extinguished in a single day. Survivors returned with aircraft damaged beyond repair and with confidence permanently shaken. More damaging than material loss was the destruction of institutional memory. Squadrons that had once passed down combat knowledge informally through veterans now consisted largely of pilots with little experience and no mentors. From this point forward, Japanese naval aviation could no longer function as an offensive instrument. American forces, by contrast, absorbed losses without losing capability. Pilots completed combat tours and rotated home, where they trained new arrivals using lessons drawn directly from recent engagements. Doctrine evolved continuously, incorporating radar coordination, altitude management, and mutual support. Aircraft were repaired or replaced rapidly. The Hellcat was not flown until exhaustion. It was flown until replacement, and both pilot and machine were treated as components in a renewable system. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders faced a narrowing set of choices. Preserving remaining pilots meant avoiding combat and conceding airspace, which would expose fleets and ground forces to attack. Committing those pilots meant accelerating losses that could not be replaced. Strategic necessity overruled preservation. Remaining air units were committed to increasingly desperate operations, often with inadequate training and insufficient escort. The objective shifted from winning air superiority to inflicting any damage possible before inevitable loss. In this environment, air combat ceased to resemble a contest. It became a process. American radar detected. Hellcats intercepted. Japanese aircraft were destroyed in predictable numbers. Each engagement reduced Japan's remaining capability while leaving American strength largely intact. Attrition was no longer an outcome of battle. It was the mechanism of battle itself. The Hellcat had transformed air warfare into a controlled sequence of inputs and outputs. By the end of the Philippine Sea engagement, the strategic outcome of carrier air combat in the Pacific was no longer in doubt. Japan retained aircraft on paper and pilots in name, but it had lost the ability to contest the air on equal terms. The process set in motion by the Hellcat did not require brilliance or risk. It required only repetition. And repetition, by 1944, overwhelmingly favored one side. The transformation of Japanese air tactics in late 1944 was not driven by ideology, honor, or sudden fanaticism. It was driven by arithmetic. Conventional attack profiles against American fleets now produced outcomes that were almost perfectly predictable. Carrier strikes approached from range. Hellcats intercepted under radar control, and attacking aircraft were destroyed before weapons release. As engagement data accumulated, Japanese planners were forced to confront a conclusion that could not be argued away. The probability of a successful conventional strike had approached zero. This realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as a calculation. Each sortie consumed fuel, aircraft, and pilots that could not be replaced. Each interception by Hellcats further reduced the remaining pool of trained aircrew. Under these conditions, continuing to fly traditional missions no longer represented resistance. It represented liquidation. Japanese air units were being expended without effect, and commanders understood that repeating the same approach would only accelerate collapse. The response was the adoption of kamikaze warfare. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who formalized the program, framed the decision in explicitly statistical terms. A conventional attack, he argued, might succeed once in hundreds of attempts. A deliberate collision increased the probability of hitting a target to roughly 30%. In both cases, the pilot was unlikely to survive. One method, at least, offered a measurable return. The choice was not between life and death, but between negligible impact and some chance of damage. From the American perspective, this shift did not change the fundamental structure of air defense. Hellcats became the primary counter to kamikaze operations, just as they had been against conventional strikes. During the Okinawa campaign, from April to June 1945, American carrier groups faced nearly 2,000 suicide sorties. The response was continuous combat air patrol, layered by altitude and coordinated through radar and fighter direction officers. Interceptions were conducted as far from the fleet as possible, preserving ships while maximizing engagement opportunities. The results were decisive and consistent. Approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft were destroyed before reaching American vessels. Hellcat pilots refined interception tactics to prioritize speed and repetition rather than pursuit. Sweeping formations covered wide sectors, allowing multiple aircraft to be engaged in a single pass. The Hellcat's durability allowed pilots to remain on station longer, absorbing minor damage without immediate withdrawal and returning to intercept additional attackers during the same sortie. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia later described these tactics as mechanical rather than heroic. Hellcat pilots attacked in coordinated groups, making high-speed firing passes through incoming formations, then climbing back to altitude to repeat the process. There was no circling combat and no attempt to identify individual opponents. Targets were treated as objects to be removed from the airspace. Effectiveness was measured in prevented impacts, not personal victories. For Japanese pilots, the contrast was stark. By late 1944 and early 1945, many entering combat had fewer than 50 flight hours. Some had never fired their weapons in aerial combat. Training had been compressed to the bare minimum, focused primarily on basic flight and takeoff procedures. These pilots faced Hellcats flown by men with hundreds of hours in type, guided by radar, supported by wingmen, and operating within a system designed to protect them and replace them if lost. Under such conditions, survival became increasingly random. Individual courage or flying skill could no longer compensate for overwhelming structural disadvantage. Japanese pilots often encountered Hellcats before they could locate the fleet, and those who survived initial interception faced additional patrols layered between them and their targets. Even when an aircraft penetrated the defensive screen, damage sustained during interception frequently prevented accurate control during the final dive. By early 1945, Japanese air units existed largely on paper. Aircraft shortages limited sortie rates. Fuel scarcity restricted training and operational flexibility. Pilot attrition eliminated experienced leadership at the squadron level. Units deployed to forward airfields often lacked spare parts, maintenance capability, or realistic prospects of sustained operations. The Hellcat's constant presence ensured that any attempt to mass air power would be detected, intercepted, and dismantled before achieving effect. The psychological impact of this environment was profound. Japanese pilots understood that Hellcats represented not a single enemy aircraft, but an entire defensive system that could not be bypassed or overwhelmed. Engagements were brief, lethal, and impersonal. There was no opportunity to adapt tactics in flight, no margin for improvisation. Once detected, the sequence of events was largely fixed. By the final months of the war, air superiority in the Pacific was no longer contested. It was enforced. American carriers operated under a persistent Hellcat umbrella that denied Japanese aircraft access to every altitude band. While the war's conclusion would be determined by ground operations and strategic bombing, the outcome in the air had already been decided. The Hellcat had not simply defeated Japanese aviation. It had rendered further resistance mathematically untenable. The final assessment of the Hellcat's impact emerged only after the war had ended, when Japanese engineers, test pilots, and naval officers were able to examine the aircraft without the pressure of survival. Removed from the urgency of combat, they approached the Hellcat not as an enemy to be defeated, but as an object to be understood. What they discovered was not a single breakthrough or hidden advantage, but a fundamentally different way of building, maintaining, and employing air power. Central to that realization was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine. Japanese engineers were struck less by its raw output than by how it was produced. The engine consisted of thousands of precisely machined components designed to be interchangeable. Entire assemblies could be removed and replaced in hours by maintenance crews with standard tools. Japanese aircraft engines, by contrast, required individual fitting. Parts were often unique to a specific engine. Repair times stretched from days into weeks, and operational availability suffered accordingly. The airframe told the same story. The Hellcat was deliberately overbuilt by Japanese standards, stressed to withstand forces far beyond those expected in normal operations. Pilots routinely exceeded limits that would have destroyed a Zero outright. Damage that would have written off a Japanese fighter often resulted in a Hellcat returning safely to its carrier. Armor, redundancy, and conservative structural margins were not signs of inefficiency. They were design choices intended to preserve pilots and keep aircraft flying. This approach reflected a deeper doctrinal difference. American aviation doctrine treated pilot experience as a renewable but valuable resource. Aircraft were expected to take damage, pilots were expected to survive, and both were expected to return to service quickly. Japanese doctrine, shaped by earlier assumptions and limited industrial capacity, treated pilots as expendable once trained. Aircraft were optimized to avoid damage rather than endure it. When those assumptions failed, there was no margin left. Production figures reinforced the imbalance. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced more than 12,000 Hellcats in roughly 30 months. Factories operated continuously, protected by geography and sustained by uninterrupted access to raw materials. Japan, under constant bombing and suffering from resource shortages, produced fewer than 6,000 Zeros during the final 3 years of the war. Even when designs existed on paper, industrial reality prevented meaningful replacement. American production did more than replace losses. It allowed improvement without disruption. Later Hellcat variants incorporated incremental refinements without halting output. Training pipelines expanded alongside manufacturing. Spare parts flowed to the front in quantities Japan could not imagine. The aircraft was not treated as a finished masterpiece, but as a platform within an evolving system. In this context, comparisons of maneuverability or elegance lost relevance. In a traditional turning contest, the Zero remained more agile. Post-war testing confirmed that fact. But the Hellcat had rendered that contest obsolete by ensuring it rarely occurred. Combat was shaped before aircraft met, through detection, altitude control, and numerical presence. The Zero's strengths belonged to a form of air combat that no longer decided wars. Japanese veterans recognized this distinction with clarity in later years. Saburo Sakai, one of the few aces to survive repeated encounters with Hellcats, described the Zero as a masterpiece designed for a specific moment in aviation history. The Hellcat, he argued, was not a masterpiece at all. It was something more unsettling. It was an instrument of a future in which systems mattered more than individual excellence. The statistical record supported that judgment. The F-6F Hellcat destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat while losing fewer than 300 to opposing fighters. It produced more American aces than any other aircraft type. These numbers were not the result of extraordinary pilots alone. They were the outcome of an environment designed to multiply average performance and reduce individual risk. Japanese pilots had laughed at the Hellcat when they first encountered its specifications because it violated everything they believed about air combat. It appeared heavy, inefficient, and inelegant. By the time they understood what it truly represented, the organizational and industrial structure needed to respond no longer existed. There were no intact squadrons left to adapt, no reserves of trained pilots to experiment with new doctrine. The Hellcat did not win through elegance or daring. It did not rely on exceptional courage or sacrifice. It won by making those qualities secondary. By embedding survivability, coordination, and replacement into every level of its design and use, it removed the need for heroism as a deciding factor. In doing so, it closed the era in which air superiority could be achieved by superior warriors alone. That was its true victory. That concludes our examination of how air combat in the Pacific was reshaped not by a single battle, but by a shift in systems, doctrine, and industrial capability. The story of the Hellcat is not one of legend or individual heroics. but of decisions that quietly determined outcomes long before aircraft ever met in the sky. Thank you for watching and for spending this time with us. Subscribe to the channel to support our work, and we'll continue exploring the history behind these decisive moments.